January 17, 1945, Mount Suribachi, Iwo Jima. The volcanic ash beneath Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura's boots crunched like ground glass as he squinted through the pre-dawn darkness at the silhouettes of American P-51 Mustangs lined up on the captured airstrip below. The distant rumble of B-29 engines warming up on distant Saipan carried across the Pacific wind, a sound that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat these past months. But today would be different. Today, for the first time, those silver American fighters would escort the giant bombers all the way to his homeland. Nakamura adjusted his flight goggles and tried to push down the knot of unease forming in his chest. The Americans had captured this strategic island after 36 days of hell, turning Japan's outer defensive ring into a launching pad for their deepest penetration yet. As he watched the foreign aircraft preparing for what intelligence reports called very long-range missions, he could not have imagined that within weeks, these sleek fighters would systematically dismantle the aerial defense of the Japanese Empire, claiming over 400 of Japan's finest aircraft in just 2 months. The story of how Japanese pilots went from mockery to devastation begins not with the clash of metal and azure skies, but with the fundamental misunderstanding of American industrial philosophy. For 3 years, Japanese aviators had dominated Pacific airspace with their legendary A-6M fighters, aircraft so perfectly engineered for maneuverability and range that they seemed to dance through the air like deadly butterflies. The Zero's construction embodied the Japanese aesthetic of elegant simplicity. Lightweight aluminum stretched over minimal framework, every ounce of unnecessary weight stripped away to achieve maximum agility. In the early war years, this philosophy had proven devastatingly effective. At Pearl Harbor, over the Philippines, throughout the Dutch East Indies, Japanese pilots had carved through Allied opposition with an almost supernatural grace, their Zeros turning inside any fighter that dared challenge them. But by 1945, the war had fundamentally changed character, and with it, the demands placed upon fighter aircraft. The vast distances of the Pacific had become America's greatest strategic challenge, requiring not just air superiority over tactical battlefields, but sustained operations across thousands of miles of open ocean. This was a type of warfare that demanded not just skill and courage, but unprecedented industrial capacity and technological sophistication. The P-51 Mustang represented the culmination of American wartime engineering, a synthesis of British aerodynamic theory, American manufacturing might, and the hard-learned lessons of 3 years of global combat. When Japanese intelligence first reported the appearance of these new American fighters, the reaction among veteran pilots was largely dismissive. Flight Petty Officer Saburo Sakai, already a legend with 64 confirmed kills, later recalled his initial assessment. "We looked at intelligence photographs of this new American plane and laughed. Another heavy, lumbering machine built by a nation that values brute force over finesse." The reasoning seemed sound from a Japanese perspective. American fighters to that point had been characterized by their weight, armor, and firepower, all attributes that, while providing survivability, came at the cost of the maneuverability that Japanese pilots considered essential to air combat supremacy. This contempt was not merely professional rivalry, but reflected deeper cultural assumptions about warfare itself. Japanese military doctrine since the Meiji Restoration had emphasized the spiritual element of combat, the idea that superior training, discipline, and fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantages. Zero pilots were not merely aviators, but warriors in the samurai tradition, men who had trained for years to achieve perfect harmony between pilot, aircraft, and mission. They had spent countless hours learning to extract every possible advantage from their machines, to fight and win through superior skill rather than superior equipment. The first encounters between Zeros and Mustangs in late 1944 seemed to confirm Japanese expectations. In isolated skirmishes over the Marianas and Philippines, experienced Zero pilots still managed to hold their own, using superior knowledge of their aircraft's capabilities to avoid the Mustangs' high-speed attacks and draw American pilots into turning fights where the Zero's legendary maneuverability could prove decisive. Flight Warrant Officer Yasuhiko Kuroe, after test flying a captured P-51 at the Japanese Army Air Inspection Center, provided what seemed like reassuring intelligence. The American fighter has excellent equipment and good speed characteristics, but its turning radius at combat speeds is inferior to our Zero. A properly handled Zero should still maintain tactical advantage in close combat. Yet even these early encounters contained ominous signs for those trained to interpret them. American pilots were no longer engaging in the individual combat that had characterized earlier phases of the war. Instead, they fought in coordinated pairs and flights, using radio communication and disciplined tactics to create numerical advantages at the point of contact. More troubling still, these American pilots showed no inclination to engage in the turning fights that Japanese doctrine considered the essence of air combat. Instead, they used their speed advantage to control the terms of engagement, diving in for quick attacks and then climbing away before Japanese pilots could bring their superior maneuverability to bear. The true scope of the challenge facing Japanese air defense became apparent only when American forces secured Iwo Jima in March 1945. This sulfurous speck of volcanic rock, strategically positioned between the Marianas and Japan proper, transformed overnight from a defensive outpost into the world's most advanced forward operating base. Within days of the island's capture, American engineers were extending runways, installing fuel systems, and constructing the complex infrastructure necessary to support long-range fighter operations. The sight of hundreds of P-51 Mustangs arriving on Iwo Jima sent shockwaves through Japanese command headquarters in Tokyo. For the first time in the war, American fighters possessed both the range to escort bombers all the way to Japanese targets and the performance to dominate any aerial opposition they encountered. The mathematics were stark and unforgiving. From Iwo Jima, a P-51 could fly 1,500 miles on internal fuel alone, enough to reach any target in the Japanese home islands and return safely. With external drop tanks, the range extended even further, allowing American fighters to loiter over targets, engaging in prolonged combat while still retaining sufficient fuel for the long overwater return flight. April 7, 1945, marked the beginning of the end for Japanese air superiority. On that spring morning, 108 P-51D Mustangs took off from Iwo Jima's steel matting runways, climbing into formation for their rendezvous with 107 B-29 Superfortresses bound for the Nakajima Aircraft Factory near Tokyo. For Japanese fighter pilots scrambling to intercept this formation, the sight must have been both magnificent and terrifying. A stream of silver aircraft stretching across the Pacific sky, protected by fighters that could match any aircraft in the Japanese inventory for speed and altitude performance. The Japanese response that day represented everything that remained of their once mighty fighter force. Approximately 110 to 125 fighters rose to challenge the American formation, a mixture of veteran pilots flying the last airworthy Zeros and newer aircraft like the Kai-84 Hayate and J-2M Raiden, flown by barely trained replacement pilots with fewer than 50 hours of combat experience. The disparity in pilot quality had become perhaps the most critical factor in the aerial war. American pilots arriving in the Pacific by 1945 typically had over 300 hours of flight training, including advanced instruction in gunnery, formation flying, and radio communication. Their Japanese counterparts, victims of an accelerated training program necessitated by catastrophic losses, often arrived at operational squadrons with barely enough experience to handle their aircraft in routine flight conditions. The battle that ensued over Tokyo that April morning shattered any remaining illusions about Japanese aerial capability. Major James B. Tapp, leading a flight of 15th Fighter Group Mustangs, described the engagement with clinical precision. They came at us in ones and twos, just like they always had. No coordination, no mutual support. We broke into our standard defensive weave and picked them off systematically. Captain Robert W. Moore's account was even more direct. I got 2 kills within 45 seconds. They were flying straight and level, apparently unaware that we were closing on them until it was too late. The tactical revolution represented by these engagements extended far beyond individual pilot skill. American fighters were equipped with sophisticated radio communication systems that allowed unprecedented coordination between aircraft and with ground controllers. The ANARA-8 homing radio, nicknamed Uncle Dog by American pilots, provided precise navigation assistance, while multiple radio channels enabled complex tactical maneuvers that would have been impossible for earlier generation fighters. Japanese aircraft, by contrast, either lacked radio equipment entirely or were fitted with crude, unreliable systems that frequently failed under combat conditions. Perhaps most significantly, American pilots had developed tactical doctrines specifically designed to neutralize Japanese advantages while maximizing their own. The hit-and-run tactics that characterized American fighter operations in 1945 represented a complete philosophical shift from the individual combat that had dominated earlier air warfare. Rather than seeking single combat with individual opponents, American pilots fought as teams, using speed and altitude to control engagement parameters and coordinated attacks to overwhelm defensive reactions. Lieutenant E.L. Bright's description of that first Tokyo raid captured the one-sided nature of these encounters. I saw about 50 fighters. The ones I saw were just sitting ducks. You just drove up behind them and pulled the trigger. This was not merely superior technology in action, but the result of systematic tactical evolution based on 3 years of hard-learned combat experience. American training programs had analyzed thousands of combat reports, identifying the specific techniques most likely to produce victory against Japanese aircraft and pilots. The results of that first escort mission sent shockwaves through Japanese military leadership. American fighters and bombers together claimed 71 Japanese aircraft destroyed, with 30 more probably destroyed and 44 damaged. Against this, the Americans lost only 2 P-51s. Sergeant Burdell Hansen, viewing the battle from a B-29 gunner's position, provided perhaps the most vivid description. The Mustangs were knocking Japs down all over the sky. For a while there during the fight, there were Japs parachuting down all around us. I'll never forget it. These statistics represented more than tactical victory. They announced the arrival of a new era in Pacific air warfare. For Japanese commanders who had grown accustomed to fighting a defensive war with gradually diminishing resources, the prospect of facing daily raids by hundreds of long-range American fighters represented a strategic catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. The careful husbanding of aircraft and fuel that had characterized Japanese operations since 1943 suddenly became meaningless in the face of American industrial production that could replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. In the weeks following that first escort mission, the pattern of Japanese aerial defeat became as predictable as it was devastating. American fighters returned to Japanese airspace repeatedly, sometimes escorting B-29 formations, but increasingly conducting independent fighter sweeps designed specifically to destroy Japanese aircraft wherever they could be found. These operations represented the evolution of American air doctrine from defensive escort missions to offensive counter-air campaigns, seeking to destroy enemy air capability at its source rather than simply defending against attacks. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots proved as destructive as the physical losses. Veterans like Saburo Sakai later described the profound disorientation of facing opponents who possessed not just superior equipment, but fundamentally different tactical philosophies. We had trained our entire careers to fight individual combat, pilot against pilot, machine against machine. But these Americans didn't fight that way. They fought like a machine themselves, coordinated and relentless. You might outmaneuver one, only to find two more diving on you from different angles. Flight Lieutenant Yohei Hinoki, one of the first Japanese pilots to shoot down a P-51 in late 1943, experienced firsthand the evolution of American capability when he encountered the new fighters over Japan in 1945. His description of flying the captured P-51 Evelina at the Japanese Test Center provided crucial insight into American engineering philosophy. I was very impressed by the roomy seat, and I did not have any trouble with my artificial leg on the rudder pedal. There was a bulletproof glass with better transparency than our thin Japanese glass, and the seat was surrounded by thick steel plate, which I had never seen in a fighter before. Overall, it was better equipped than any Japanese airplane I had ever seen. This observation highlighted one of the fundamental differences between Japanese and American aircraft design philosophy, where Japanese engineers had stripped away every possible ounce of weight to maximize performance. American designers had added protection, equipment, and capability even at the cost of some theoretical performance advantage. The result was aircraft that could not just perform, but survive, and pilots who could return to fight again rather than being lost to wounds that better protection might have prevented. The mechanical reliability that Japanese test pilots noted in captured American aircraft proved equally significant in sustained operations. Japanese engines of 1945 were notorious for oil leaks, mechanical failures, and reduced power output due to inferior metallurgy and fuel quality. American fighters, by contrast, were powered by Packard-built Merlin engines that represented the finest achievements of mass production engineering, capable of reliable operation under combat conditions while maintaining full power output throughout their operational life. As American fighter sweeps intensified throughout the spring and summer of 1945, Japanese losses mounted with mathematical precision. Mission after mission returned with claims of dozens of enemy aircraft destroyed, while American losses remained minimal. The April 19th and 22nd raids proved particularly devastating, with American fighters claiming 32 Japanese aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat, plus 30 destroyed and 70 damaged by strafing attacks on airfields. The P-51s achieved such complete tactical surprise during these attacks that the initial wave over Kanoya Airfield actually received a green light from the control tower, clearance to land, as they approached at high speed for their strafing runs. The symbolic power of this moment cannot be overstated. Japanese air traffic controllers, trained to recognize the distinctive silhouettes of friendly aircraft, had become so accustomed to the absence of their own fighters that they mistook attacking Americans for returning friends. This represented not just tactical failure, but the complete collapse of situational awareness that characterized Japanese air defense by mid-1945. Throughout these operations, one recurring symbol appeared in American pilot accounts: the abundance of supplies that characterized their operations. While Japanese pilots struggled with fuel shortages, inferior lubricants, and ammunition rationing, their American counterparts operated with a logistical lavishness that must have seemed almost supernatural. P-51s returned from 7-hour missions with fuel to spare. Pilots who expended their ammunition in combat could expect immediate resupply for the next day's operations. Damaged aircraft were quickly repaired or replaced entirely, while Japanese workshops struggled to cannibalize parts from wrecked aircraft to keep others airworthy. This material abundance reflected not just American industrial capacity, but a fundamental philosophical difference in how the two nations approached the challenge of sustained warfare. Japanese military culture, rooted in traditions of austerity and spiritual discipline, viewed material limitations as challenges to be overcome through superior training and fighting spirit. American military doctrine, by contrast, treated logistics as the foundation of all successful operations, investing enormous resources in supply systems designed to ensure that combat units never lacked for anything they needed to complete their missions. Major James Tapp's achievement of 3 kills on the first Tokyo raid exemplified this systematic approach to aerial warfare. Rather than relying solely on individual skill and determination, Tapp and his fellow pilots benefited from months of specialized training in long-range escort procedures, standardized tactical formations, and coordinated attack techniques. Their radios allowed real-time communication and mutual support that would have been impossible for earlier generation fighters. Their aircraft carried not just superior firepower, but sophisticated gun sights that increased hit probability and reduced ammunition consumption. The June 1st disaster over the Pacific provided perhaps the most vivid illustration of the environmental challenges that American forces had learned to overcome through superior equipment and procedures. When 148 P-51s encountered an unexpected thunderstorm front en route to Osaka, 27 aircraft were lost to weather-related causes, collisions, icing, and loss of control in severe turbulence. 24 pilots died in this single incident, representing the costliest weather-related loss in Pacific air operations history. Yet even this tragedy demonstrated American systematic approach to operational challenges. Within hours of the disaster, 7 Fighter Command initiated comprehensive reviews of weather forecasting procedures, navigation systems, and formation techniques. New protocols were developed for dealing with unexpected weather, including standardized procedures for formation breakup and individual navigation in emergency conditions. The sophisticated air-sea rescue network that had been established along standard mission routes immediately mobilized to search for survivors, demonstrating the depth of planning that characterized American operations. By contrast, Japanese forces lacked both the equipment and institutional capacity to conduct similar systematic improvements. Weather forecasting remained primitive. Navigation equipment was inadequate for precision flying in adverse conditions, and rescue capabilities were virtually non-existent for pilots forced down over water. The result was that Japanese losses to non-combat causes often exceeded combat losses, creating a steady degradation of capability that no amount of individual heroism could overcome. As summer 1945 progressed, the pattern of Japanese aerial defeat became increasingly predictable. American fighter sweeps encountered diminishing opposition not because Japanese resolve had weakened, but because Japanese capability had been systematically destroyed. Mission reports from this period describe attacks on airfields where American pilots found mostly dummy aircraft, extensive camouflage efforts, and widely dispersed planes that had been drained of fuel to prevent fires when strafed. The desperate measures employed by Japanese forces in their final months revealed the complete collapse of their air defense system. Pilots attacking Tokyo area airfields encountered barrage balloons, kites designed to tangle propellers, landmines triggered by low-flying aircraft, and even cables stretched across runways. At Tokorozawa Airfield, Japanese defenders erected a 50-foot-high cable barrier in a last-ditch attempt to down American fighters during strafing runs. These improvised defenses represented not tactical innovation, but the final expedients of a force that had exhausted all conventional means of resistance. The human cost of this systematic destruction extended far beyond mere statistics. Japanese pilots who had trained for years to achieve mastery of their craft found themselves facing opponents whose superiority stemmed not from individual skill, but from systematic advantages in equipment, training, logistics, and tactical doctrine. Veterans like Saburo Sakai, who had survived 3 years of Pacific combat, discovered that their accumulated expertise had become largely irrelevant in the face of American technological and industrial supremacy. Captain Robert Moore's description of achieving 2 kills within 45 seconds during the first Tokyo raid captured the impersonal efficiency that characterized American aerial operations by 1945. This was not individual combat between warriors, but industrial warfare in which superior systems systematically destroyed inferior ones. The romance of aerial combat that had characterized earlier phases of the war gave way to a more mechanical process in which American pilots applied standardized techniques to achieve predictable results. Yet even as Japanese air power collapsed under American pressure, individual acts of courage and skill continued to demonstrate the quality of Japanese pilots when circumstances permitted. The few encounters where experienced Japanese aviators managed to engage American fighters on favorable terms still resulted in significant American losses, proving that pilot quality remained a crucial factor when other variables were equalized. These isolated successes, however, could not alter the fundamental strategic reality that Japan faced: an opponent with virtually unlimited industrial capacity conducting sustained operations beyond Japanese ability to counter. The testimony of Japanese test pilot Yasuhiko Kuro, after extensive evaluation of the captured P-51 Evelina, provided perhaps the most honest assessment of the challenge facing Japanese aviation. "I had such confidence with this P-51 that I feared no Japanese fighters." This statement from a 30-victory ace represented more than professional admiration. It was recognition that American aircraft design had achieved a level of overall capability that Japanese industry could not match with existing resources and manufacturing capacity. The systematic nature of American operations became evident in the careful establishment of navigation aids, rescue services, and communication networks that supported long-range fighter missions. The Uncle Dog homing system, utilizing modified B-29s as navigation beacons, allowed P-51 formations to rendezvous precisely with bomber streams over vast ocean distances. The extensive air-sea rescue network, featuring surface submarines, specialized rescue aircraft, and amphibious vehicles, provided pilot recovery capabilities that significantly reduced personnel losses from operational accidents and combat damage. These support systems reflected an understanding of warfare as a comprehensive undertaking requiring not just combat capability, but the entire infrastructure necessary to sustain operations indefinitely. Japanese forces, constrained by limited resources and increasingly desperate strategic circumstances, could not develop comparable systems even when they understood their necessity. The result was that American operations became more effective and sustainable over time, while Japanese capability steadily degraded under the cumulative effects of losses, mechanical failures, and resource shortages. The final VLR mission, flown on August 14, 1945, the last day of the war, involved a massive 4-group effort that demonstrated the scale of American air power deployed against Japan by war's end. Over 400 P-51s participated in this final operation, more fighters than the Japanese had managed to assemble for any single engagement since early 1944. This quantitative disparity reflected not just industrial production, but fundamental differences in how the two nations approached the challenge of sustained warfare. In retrospect, the destruction of Japanese air power during those 2 critical months of spring 1945 represented more than tactical victory. It demonstrated the triumph of systematic industrial warfare over traditional military virtues of individual skill and spiritual determination. American success stemmed not from superior courage or flying ability, but from the patient development of technological, tactical, and logistical systems that rendered traditional concepts of aerial combat obsolete. The P-51 Mustang served as the perfect symbol of this transformation. Its 6 .50-caliber machine guns represented not just firepower, but precision manufacturing that could produce thousands of identical weapons with identical performance characteristics. Its Packard Merlin engine embodied not just power, but the systematic application of metallurgical science to achieve unprecedented reliability. Its radio equipment enabled not just communication, but the coordination that transformed individual aircraft into elements of a larger tactical system. For Japanese pilots who had trained their entire careers to excel in individual combat, this systematic approach to warfare represented a fundamental challenge to everything they understood about aerial fighting. Veterans like Saburo Sakai, reflecting on their wartime experiences decades later, recognized that they had been defeated not by superior opponents, but by superior systems. We were still thinking of air combat as individual duels between warriors. The Americans had turned it into industrial process. The human tragedy of this transformation extended beyond the hundreds of Japanese pilots lost during those critical months. It encompassed the destruction of an entire martial tradition that had defined Japanese military aviation since its inception. The careful cultivation of individual skill that had produced aces like Sakai, Nishizawa, and dozens of others became irrelevant in the face of American mass production techniques that could train adequate pilots faster than Japan could train exceptional ones. Yet the story of Japanese pilots' encounter with American P-51 Mustangs over their homeland in 1945 represents more than military defeat. It marked the transition from warfare as individual contest to warfare as industrial undertaking. The mockery that greeted early intelligence reports about American fighter capability gave way to respectful recognition of systematic superiority that could not be overcome through traditional means. The 400 Japanese aircraft lost during those 2 months represented not just tactical defeat, but the end of an era in which individual warrior virtues could triumph over material disadvantage. In the end, the silver Mustangs that swept Japanese skies in spring 1945 served as harbingers of a new age, one in which victory would belong not to the most skilled or determined combatants, but to those nations capable of sustaining the complex industrial and technological systems that modern warfare demanded. The Zero had been a perfect expression of Japanese aesthetic and tactical values, elegant, efficient, and deadly in the hands of a master pilot. The Mustang represented something different: the systematic application of industrial capacity to the challenge of aerial warfare, resulting in capability that rendered individual mastery irrelevant. The final irony of this transformation lay in the fact that both aircraft succeeded brilliantly at what they were designed to accomplish. The Zero had given Japan tactical air superiority when tactical air superiority was sufficient to achieve strategic objectives. The Mustang provided America with the capability to conduct sustained operations over unlimited distances when such capability had become the foundation of strategic success. Neither aircraft was inherently superior. Each perfectly embodied the strategic requirements and industrial capabilities of the nation that produced it. But by 1945, the strategic requirements of Pacific warfare had evolved beyond Japanese industrial capacity to meet them, while American industrial capacity had finally matched the strategic requirements that victory demanded. The result was not the triumph of individual machines or pilots, but the victory of the systematic approach to warfare that would define military operations for the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. In this context, the P-51 Mustang served not just as a weapon, but as a symbol of the industrial democracy that had learned to mobilize its full resources in service of strategic objectives that individual heroism alone could never achieve.